I'm sure we're going to be starting soon. It's 5 o'clock. We're waiting on the mayor and the individuals to be able to take on the meeting.
Okay. All right, well, good evening. Today is Tuesday, May 27, 2021. The time is 5 p.m. The special meeting of the following will now come to order. The Victorville City Council and the same council also sitting as the Victorville Library Board of Trustees, the Southern California Logistics Rail Authority, Southern California Logistics Airport Authority, successor agency to the Redevelopment Agency, the City as Housing Assets successor, Joint Powers Financing Authority, and the Victorville Water District. Madam Clerk, will you kindly call the roll?
Councilmember Becerra,
Here.
Councilmember Gomez. Councilmember Gomez. Mayor Pro Tem Irving,
Present.
Mayor Jones.
Here.
Mayor Jones, I can see Councilmember Gomez, but I cannot hear her.
Is her mic muted?
It is muted right now.
Member Gomez, will you unmute your mic? She has co-host status.
Yes.
Okay, we're going to move on. We do have a quorum. Thank you. And this evening we have with us Assistant Pastor Jason Villalobos with Calvary Chapel of Victorville that will lead us in our invocation, followed by Captain John Wickham for the pledge to our great American flag.
Hi, good evening. Thank you for allowing me to be here. Can we just all bow our heads in prayer before we get started? Father, I thank you for this opportunity that you have given to me to pray here in front of the City of Council of Victorville. Lord, I know that in Romans 13:1, it reads, everyone must submit to governing authorities, for all authority comes from God, and those in positions of authority have been placed there by God. And so therefore, because of your word is truth, we thank you for placing each board member here this evening. We thank you for giving them a servant's heart to serve this city and its many residents within their jurisdiction. Lord, we ask for your guidance and presence to fill this room and this Zoom so that decisions can be made morally, justly, and unselfishly. Lord, be with everyone here that is listening, watching, and actively taking part in this meeting. Be with those here that will be addressing their concerns or thoughts regarding the city and regarding the budget. Be with the city council, and may your presence, the God of peace and the God of order, fill this room. Lastly, we know that in your word, Jesus said in John 14, verses 13 and 14, it says, and whatever you ask in my name, Jesus said, that I will do, that the Father may be glorified in the Son. If you ask anything in my name, I will do it. And so, Father, may you be glorified through the Son. We ask in Jesus' name, knowing that you, Lord, will meet us here to answer these prayers and petitions according to your word and your timing. We pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.
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 Captain Wickham. Everyone, please
Stand and
rise.
join me in the Pledge of Allegiance. Face the flag. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you for having me, guys. I'll be leaving now.
Thank you, Pastor. We appreciate it. Thank you, Captain Wickham. Madam Clerk, will you kindly present the agenda and any revisions thereto? Yes.
Sorry.
Madam Clerk?
Yes. Tonight's city council meeting is being held virtually on Zoom due to safety concerns related to COVID-19 and to reduce exposure for our community. members, city employees, and council members. Our virtual meetings are conducted in accordance with the Brown Act and special provisions enacted during the coronavirus pandemic, and will be held this way until further notice. We invite members of the public to participate in our meetings via Zoom. However, for those who do not wish to comment on issues, our meeting may be viewed on YouTube. For future council meetings, public comments may be submitted via email to the city clerks. Submissions must be received no later than 4 p.m. the day of our council meetings. Thank you, Madam Mayor. There are no revisions.
Thank you. And Member Gomez, are you with us? Your mic is muted. We need to make sure that we can hear you. Can you acknowledge that you can hear us?
Okay, I can't hear any of you guys if you guys are saying anything.
Okay, well
So
then
I can't hear none of you. If you're saying anything, I have no clue.
Sure. Member Gomez, are you on the premises? Are you at City Hall, Member Gomez? Okay, we're going to have to move on. Member Gomez, I hope that you can, if you're not on the premises, I don't know how we can get you assistance with the technical difficulty. We will hope for the best because we certainly would like you to be with us. All right, do any council members have any conflicts of interest to declare? Okay, hearing none, we're going to move on. Before I read the introduction to public comments, Madam Clerk, do we have any requests to speak?
You give it a few seconds to see if any hands are raised. At this time, there is no hands raised, no speakers.
All right, very good. Then we're going to move on from the public comment period. And before we begin, our budget workshop, this is the first meeting behind the dais and in council chambers for our newest council members. And this environment might feel a little bit different for each of us, especially with the new setup, but we'll all become accustomed to it in short order. But I welcome my colleagues behind the dais. It's a good day, so let's have a wonderful meeting. And the chair offers a friendly reminder for all members to lend themselves to our policies and procedures so that we can have a productive and smooth meeting. All right, that said, we're going to move on to our first and only business in order this evening, and that is our budget workshop, item number 1, Mr. Metzler.
Thank you, Madam Mayor and members of the council. Certainly appreciate the opportunity for us all to be here today in the chambers to be able to meet in person and dialogue in person about a matter that effectively is going to help guide us through the next fiscal year, which is the 21-22 fiscal year. And with this, we have a presentation for you, which is the draft of the proposed budget for the fiscal year ending 22. And this presentation is really intended to take a high-level approach and interpret for you and also for members of the public in a much higher level view than what's contained in the binders that are in front of us. That is nearly 200 pages worth of numbers and spreadsheets. And with the presentation, the view that we're sharing with you, it focuses heavily on the cash flow of the city. It's an approach we've taken with you and the council for the past several years so that we have a sense not only that we're considering a budget for the upcoming fiscal year, but we also have a sense of how the budget and the funds that make up the budget actually function in years to come. So with that, just starting out, and this is to recognize, of course, those that I consider part of the policy making team. Of course, the city council yourself are effectively the policy makers for the city, but you do also rely heavily upon the executive team and the city attorney's office to help you execute upon those decided policies that we take on. And this budget document is probably one of the largest policy documents that you get to see every year. But also you make policy each and every council meeting as we review and consider and approve actual agenda items at each of those meetings. So policy is something that we deal with on a regular basis. But of course, we can't do what we need to do without a strong team behind us. And certainly we as the executive team rely very heavily upon a leadership team, which is outlined here, largely comprising your officers and directors of the various departments or divisions of the city. And with their help, we've been able to compile this budget. But deeper in the trenches, the ones that we really have to thank are those that are piecing it all together, largely the finance team. I'd like to specifically give attention to Ms. Kim Scott, who's here in attendance, Mr. Adam Cripps, who also here is in attendance with us, Christina James, who is not here, but she's very much involved, Lazaro Ramirez, and Nikisha Blewett is here as well. And of course, John Mendiola, our Director of Finance, is very instrumental in leading that team. To give you what we have is your draft budget. One of the things that we were able to do.
Mr. Metzler, if I could ask you to hold for just a moment. So council members, as we're looking at this PowerPoint, we have the hard copy in front of us that you can follow along with. Please feel free to take notes because we're going to hold our questions until the end. And the chair is going to up our normal 2-minute period for asking questions to 5 minutes, hoping that that will give us all sufficient time to deal with a very complex subject. Thank you, Mr. Metzler.
For the chair, would you please repeat the last part of the upping of time?
Can you hear me now, Member Gomez?
Yeah, I have 2 devices on.
Okay, so maybe that was part of the problem. So, Madam Clerk, will you kindly mark Member Gomez as present during the meeting? All right, and we're glad that you're with us, Member Gomez. So what I was just saying is that we have a hard copy of the PowerPoint presentation in front of us. And so I've invited the council members to follow along and make notes as they go so that at the end of the presentation, we'll each have an opportunity to ask questions. And instead of the normal 2-minute period, we're going to up it to 5 minutes so that we can properly handle the complex issue of our budget. Thank you, Member Gomez. Mr. Metzler.
Please note, add mine. I don't have it in front of me. In my inbox, I'll pick it up
Okay.
next time.
Member Gomez, you have not been recognized by the chair. Would you like to be recognized?
Yes, I would.
Thank you. Go ahead, please.
Yes, everyone has something in front of them, a presentation. I don't have it in front of me. If it was placed in my box, I'll pick it up next time. Thank you.
Certainly. Thank you, Member Gomez. Mr. Metzler.
Thank you, Madam Mayor and members of the council. I do have to acknowledge 2 more people that I had forgotten to give attention to. Mr. Tony Camargo, who's listening virtually and observing virtually, was very much instrumental working with me and the finance team. Kara Mostrom as well. It played a major role in helping us get to this point. So I wanted to give those particular recognitions and extensions of my gratitude for all the hard work and additional time they had to put in to bring us to this point. So with that, this year is the first year I started out with a manager's budget message. And I did so because last year in October, we actually completed a fairly monumental task, and that was developing a strategic plan for the city that really yielded from a number of discussions with community members, with council members, with staff members to help establish mission, visions, and goals, helps establish our goals and priorities. And so with that, this budget was prepared relying on the strategic plan adopted by the Victorville City Council in October of 2020. This budget was prepared relying on the feedback from those residents, staff, and city council to help shape our mission, vision, and goals. This budget focuses on the 9 agreed upon priorities while investing in the human resources necessary to achieve those goals. And so with that, and throughout the presentation, we'll be able to touch on many of those, many of which we've accomplished already and many of which we'll accomplish in the upcoming fiscal year. But in this presentation, just to give a sense of highlight of what this budget includes, and there's some common words that I used. in this particular slide, and that's the word significant, because I think this budget is very significant. This budget is very significant, especially considering where we've been over the last few years. And if you can remember back over the last 10 years, this budget will look significant in terms of change, especially as we compare year over year. But it does contain some significant public safety enhancements. It does contain significant community service enhancements. It actually has a focus on maintaining a strong general fund reserve. You'll actually see strong revenue growth throughout this budget presentation. You'll see a very strong investment in personnel, something that's much needed considering the very limited resources we've had over the last 10, 12 years to get us to this point. And then you'll also see a very significant investment in our public infrastructure. All of these particular highlights touch on a goal or priority found in your strategic plan. This budget, it's important to identify at the start always what are the budget assumptions that are placed in here. And we've actually included these assumptions in the budget document. In particular, we did sustain, or we included numbers in the sales tax level lines that actually are sustained. And this is actually a big deal, especially last year, dealing with the uncertainties of the pandemic and the view that potentially sales tax could drop. We're actually able to feel confident in the numbers that we present that show a sustainable sales tax level. We also are sustaining development activity. We've seen strong growth over the last year, and we'll highlight later in the presentation a lot of what we envision occurring over the next fiscal year. One of the things that this budget does do, and it carries a recommendation, is to increase the general fund reserve target. We've given considerable amount of thought and study over the existing policy and upgrading it to be even more fiscally responsible. The addition of new positions citywide is a very heavy focus on this budget. And we have to recognize the need for salary and benefit enhancements because we do believe certainly that in many cases we're behind the curve, which is affecting our ability to recruit and retain. And then I think finally it's important to recognize, especially for those forms of services that we offer, such as water, sewer, trash, electric utility services. There's a number of services we provide that are supported by rate plans where we go through an exhaustive rate study to determine the cost of service and then what is the rate structure necessary to support those cost of service levels. And when we adopt those plans, we adopt those plans typically containing rate recommendations for the next 5 years. And so those rate supported enterprises do carry forward in this budget document the recommended rate increases necessary to sustain our cost of services. So those are the budget assumptions that are built into the budget binder and the budget presentation you have here tonight. This is the look at the organization from the high level. And one of the things, and especially relating to some of the questions that I've received over the last few days with respect to certain changes, especially if you look at page 3 of your budget binder and you note certain changes. Planning was one department where there was a notable change. I think it was about 630% change year over year. And it wasn't because we added 630% worth of real cost to the actual planning department. Last year, if you'll recall, we did do some organizational realignment. And this budget actually allows us to catch up with the accounting and basically starts placing the accounting aligned with the actual functions that go into those new departments. I think the best example I can give is in last year's budget, homeless services and solutions was something that was costed out of the city manager's department. And we've, as a part of the functional reorg, aligned that with our planning division. So that's an example of one cost that really didn't change from a personnel standpoint, but actually changed in terms of where that was in the organization. So there's a lot of those departmental change increases that you'll see that look big, largely because they were placed in a different location and weren't sourced in one particular department last year. Just at the high level, the budget draft that we have before you, and as it's currently drafted, we do envision minor changes between now and budget adoption. And when we get to the budget adoption point, we'll actually call out all the changes. But if you'll actually take a look at the slide, just comparing fiscal year over fiscal year, you'll actually see in fiscal year ending 21, you had citywide revenues of $233 million versus $265 million of an expenses with a deficit spend of $32.4 million. That's in the very aggregate sense of all city operations. And the reason why we put the total funds managed at the bottom, and we've kind of shared the concept or the perspective in which we operate on a fund accounting basis. The 81 funds, we effectively treat the funds as 81 different forms of business of the city. So when somebody says you made $233 million of revenue, but you spent 265, how do you do that? Private business would probably be in deep trouble if they did that. But each of those funds largely contain cash balance. And so to the extent, for example, you have a hefty year on the capital expense side, which you can see for that 21 fiscal year ending capital improvements of 55.1 million. That's largely what attributes to those deficit spends, where effectively over time you save up money to be able to tackle those big one-time expenses. But in this fiscal year ending 22, what we have before you in this budget document is a budget that we would consider we would call balanced. It's a $297.1 million aggregate budget against $293.7 million in aggregate expenditures. And that gives you a surplus of $3.4 million. Capital improvements inside that $293 million figure is about $60.1 million. And one thing that I'll call attention to, because if you were actually to compare the column there with the fiscal year ending 21, the $265 million budget. If you actually compared it to the binder from last year, the number in the binder from last year would be different. And I want to call attention to that is because even as we prepare to adopt this $293.7 million budget this year, that will continue to change each and every time we bring an agenda item to the council. For example, when there's a request for an additional appropriation, that becomes actually an alteration to the budget, to where you're actually either increasing the revenue or the expenditure or both, depending upon those fiscal recommendations that go with the items throughout the fiscal year. But one of the things that we call attention to is we actually increase the number of funds that we manage this year. One of the new funds that are added, of course, is dealing specifically with Measure P. And then, of course, because we have been navigating, still are navigating, the tail ends of the pandemic, we actually had to create a fund to monitor our costs associated with the coronavirus relief efforts. Broken down, this chart is intended to show how those revenues and expenditures are broken down by category. And on the revenue side, one of the things that I like to call attention to when I look at the pie chart on the left is there's a general misconception that all of our revenues effectively comprise taxes, and that's not exactly the case. And this pie chart really kind of helps illustrate that. And in fact, taxes, it doesn't comprise the largest of our revenue category. And here it shows the taxes, which comprise things like sales tax, property tax, transient occupancy tax, only makes up about 27% of your revenue generation on the aggregate $297 million number. Charges for service is what is really the largest of categories. And those would be the fees for services. Those are your water fees. Those are your sewer fees. Those are your plan check fees. Those are your solid waste fees, for example. And then just broken it down so you can see it differently on the expense side, operations and maintenance, personnel and capital Those three categories themselves comprise about 62% of your total expenditures. And then the types, we mentioned the 83 funds that earlier that we manage. The funds are broken down into different fund types. And the largest of the fund type that we're responsible, you'll commonly hear enterprise funds. I think the easiest way to describe those is that they're business funds. Probably your largest enterprise fund is your water district fund. And effectively, the funds for each respective enterprise have to be spent for that particular business function. So in the case of the water enterprise, the budget associated with that would be revenues being spent against expenditures directly related to the water business, as an example. Your most discretionary fund is your general fund, which comprises 26% of the total budget. And then one thing to call out here, it's a small sliver, but we are accounting for Measure P separately, and that's to be consistent in being able to isolate and identify the expenditures to make sure that they're being spent consistent with the intent of the Measure P ballot measure. So general fund is broken down here on this particular slide. And in this particular case, as mentioned, this is your most discretionary fund. The general fund is something that's typically used to measure the city's health, and we'll actually showcase this on a cash flow basis in some of the forward slides. But your general fund broken down is 75.8, almost $75.9 million in revenue against $77.4 million in expense. It does still have a loan coming in to be repaid from the Victorville Municipal Utility Services in the order of $1 million. And so this particular fund, the general fund, actually does propose a deficit spend, which means it will rely on unencumbered fund balance or cash to make it through the year. Not uncommon. The next slide actually kind of breaks down the larger of the revenue categories. So your general fund is comprised of property tax, sales tax, transient occupancy tax. Those top three right there are a total of 59% of your entire general fund. Cost allocation is another charge where effectively for general services, admin services that aren't revenue generating but support to other departments get charged out against other departments, including enterprises. But focusing on that 59%, taking you to the next slide, breaking down the expenditure on a pie chart basis. Interestingly, both your police and fire budgets consume the largest percentage of your general fund. And in those two particular instances, those budgets also amount to 59% of your total expenditures. This next slide, what you're going to see here is two different charts, and if you can see it graphically, there's one chart at the top and one chart at the bottom. And this chart, this slide is intended to show you what our revenues versus expenditures look like, considering the current and existing general fund reserve, but also shares with you what it looks like with our recommended change to the general fund reserve policy. One thing that we saw last year, which influenced this council's decision to pursue Measure P, was to improve the fiscal position of the general fund to try to make it more certain. What we did know last year was that revenues were being outpaced fairly dramatically by the expenses. And so we had a structural deficit built into the general fund. What you're actually seeing here with Measure P having passed, just the general fund itself, you've actually corrected in this budget that deficit, that structural deficit. In fact, this in both of these cases, the revenue lines that you're looking at, they're actually able to assume a 4% increase year over year. And if you actually compare that to the expenditure line, that's tracking higher than the 3% year over year increase on the expense line. A large part of that reason was one of the things that we wanted to do, we intended to do, and we're able to do now is protect the general fund from the inflationary costs associated with public safety. One of the things that we regularly compared was the sheriff services contract, and not to pick on them, but that contract was one of our biggest expenses on the general fund side. And we were staring at 5 and 6% increases due to their very well-deserved MOU contracts. But that was clearly outpacing our revenue growth when we were only able to project 1 and 2%. But we actually now, with Measure P, have the ability to create a preservation fund to where Measure P can be used to at least preserve those existing levels. I believe it was about 130 members of on the Schedule A of the Sheriff Services contract. We're actually able to create that as a revenue to the general fund. And so you've actually changed the trajectory of revenues versus expenditures resulting from that passage of Measure P, which is actually a good thing, and it brings strong health to your general fund. But the other thing that we wanted to share with you is if you were to compare, just focusing on the top chart, if you look at general fund reserves, the line that says general fund reserves, and if I'm looking at the 21-22 fiscal year, that's projecting that you'll end with 17.92 million in cash at the end of the year. And our general fund reserve requirement of 15% means you really should only have 11.61% to just meet your reserve target. And so comparing what the 17.92 million dollar means, that actually achieves a general fund reserve level of 23%. So effectively, you're tracking higher than your reserve target. One of the things that we wanted to do is figure out whether or not 15% was appropriate. One of the things that we were able to track was that the policy was adopted back in 2010. There haven't been any changes to it, and I'm not aware of any real studies that were done until this year to decide whether or not 15% was appropriate. One of the things that we were able to identify and we aimed to correct when we started studying the spend of the general fund was that we were seeing during the fiscal year periods of time where you drew down on cash significant enough to where it actually required a short-term internal borrowing during the fiscal year until revenues actual collections caught up to get your cash position back to positive. And so one of the underlying focuses in our recommendation was to try to get the general fund to be much more self-sufficient. And staff, after studying that, identified that 17% is the more appropriate level so that the general fund doesn't have to potentially depend on other funds for cash needs. And so the bottom chart, you'll see what the implication of that would look like. And you'll still see that, the general fund projections of cash at year end don't change. So you're still tracking at a reserve level of 23 to 24% going forward to the 27-28 fiscal year. The only thing that's really worth noticing the difference is the difference between your general fund reserve and that actual reserve requirement. So going from 15 to 17% really means a difference of, in the case of the 15%, you've got 6.3 million a surplus of cash versus if you change it to 17%, you've got 4.7 million of surplus cash. So that's one thing that staff is recommending going forward with this budget is changing your reserve target. This slide is really intended, I think, graphically to illustrate it a little bit more clearly. And I think it's important to show that over time, dating back to 2018, we weren't able to achieve either of those two reserve targets. But certainly since the fiscal year end of 2019, due to the conservative nature of the council and the tight budgets we've administered, in 2019 forward, we've actually started seeing the ability to set aside general fund cash. And so you can see the trend upward, mainly focusing on the blue bars. That's showing your general fund reserve. The gray bars are there to show you the actual Measure P amounts, which are not factored into your general fund reserve calculations. But with those two illustrations, if you're tracking the light blue line versus the dark blue line is representing where we would like to see the general reserve target become, which is the 17%. So now focusing on Measure P, one of the things that I will share with you is since Measure P was approved back in December, we've been focusing the last several months coordinating with all of the departments, identifying what the program needs are that are eligible to be spent towards Measure P. But we also worked very closely in forming the oversight committee, the Measure P oversight committee. And in fact, we actually convened over the last 2 weeks with the Measure P oversight committee, where just last week, we actually had some pretty meaningful dialogue, and we obtained consent approval from the Measure P Oversight Committee to do two things. First, they adopted policies that really are intended to serve as clear understanding of what the intent is, not only today, but well into the future, so that as we continue to budget Measure P well into the future, you'll have a policy document that makes it clear, undisputable as to what is an eligible expense that is consistent with the Measure P intent. And so the Measure P Oversight Committee did do that last week. They also reviewed this budget for the Measure P expenditures. And if they haven't sent it, it certainly will be a part of the budget document where they're actually sending the city council a letter opining that, in fact, the expenditures proposed to you are consistent with the intent of the Measure P. So that has been completed. And so we're pleased that we're going to be able to fulfill that part of the intent of the Measure P program. But we're currently tracking, we just had updated revenue. The Measure P is expected to generate in this fiscal year $18.948 million. We've been able to identify about $13.4 million worth of expenditures. Because we do track all funds on a cash flow basis, this slide is intended to show you what it looks like. And one of the things that we discussed as a part of the whole Measure P process was recognizing the need for it, but also there was a recognition that it wasn't the answer to all of our fiscal challenges as we can identify. This is effectively buying us some time. One of the things that we'll continue to do as staff is monitor the rest of the funds to identify where there may be some deficiencies and perhaps revenue enhancements to other funds to make sure that all 83 funds are healthy. But effectively, looking at the first column on this chart, I'm sorry, the second column, let's go to, because we will track revenues to this current fiscal year. The imposition of Measure P actually began April 1st of this calendar year. And as we receive those, I'm not aware that we've got a check yet from the state, but as we receive those, we'll be actually accounting those receipts to this fiscal year. But what you'll see in column 2, the $18.95 million figure, those are pretty fresh numbers identifying what we're expected to generate starting July 1st through June 30th of the upcoming fiscal year. One thing to highlight is, and this is to monitor, it's not to sound the alarm, but this forecast does show a deficit spend in the 25-26 fiscal year. That's something to monitor as we progress forward. But you'll also see, importantly, that in the second to last row, the Measure P reserves, you're actually, if we stuck to this plan exactly, you're actually building up a reserve to where you could have Measure P revenues for either emergency needs or special capital needs that require attention. Just highlighting it a little bit more on a granular level. What's in that cash flow that we just shared with you? This budget does contain the addition of 11 bodies to the sheriff contract. In fact, we gave you a sneak preview of that as we approved the Schedule A last, or maybe it was 2 meetings ago now. But those 11 bodies have been added to the Measure P budget. This budget does contemplate the opening of Station 315 with 6 full-time firefighter paramedics. This also includes the addition of 2 new Type 1 engines. One, of course, would be to station at Station 315, but a second would be to replace an existing frontline engine that is old enough to where it can continue to operate, but it's probably best to operate in a reserve status. This also considers the direction you had given us as a council to enhance our code enforcement and become more proactive. So it does include a number of position adds to the code enforcement division. It does include enhancements to our library services. And it does include funding to address our homeless situation here in Victorville and provides much needed funding to continue the interim homeless shelter out at West Wind Sports Center. And then finally, it does contemplate a number of facility upgrades, much needed as identified in our Park and Rec Master Plan. We're actually able to move forward on some of those improvements at those facilities as well. So one of the things that we wanted to put front and center early in this presentation is to address the personnel and the organizational needs. And certainly over the last 10 years, we've been very lean in terms of staffing level. And while we've been lean, that is to mean we've held off on the addition of positions. We've, as employees, had to forego COLAs, benefit enhancements, and all the while, over that course of time, the workload hasn't decreased. The workload certainly has increased, and you do have a very dedicated workforce. But with this budget, especially considering the expansion and service that's been tasked of this organization to provide, this budget does focus heavily upon the investment in human resource to allow us to be more effective and more efficient. And also at the same time provides an opportunity to reduce burnout, because that is in fact what we're hearing is occurring amongst the employees, considering the amount of work and workload that's continuing to increase. So with that, these are by the numbers, and the current budget has a total of 427 budgeted positions. This upcoming budget does propose 458 positions. So that's a difference of 31 positions to be funded. One of the things that we wanted to illustrate on this next slide, because that 31 addition sounds like a fairly dramatic increase in the number of employees, but when we looked back over time, and this is kind of intended also to illustrate just how lean the organization has been over the years. Even at the 458 members of the organization, that's not by far the highest level of total employees budgeted by the city. And in fact, we've highlighted that back in the 2007-2008 fiscal year, and important to note there in that fiscal year, that was the year when you had both a fire department and a water department. You may recall water is fairly new to us. We didn't have a water department prior to 2007, 2008 fiscal year. But you'll see back then with a smaller population, the total employee count was 643. Of course, we've gone through some tough times, and you can see that total employee count having dropped, and then you've seen some gradual increases over time. But this staffing level was not done arbitrarily. It was considering all of the goals and priorities of this council, and really was considered to be what's necessary to help us best achieve those goals and priorities that you've set out as a council. This one's a little bit hard to read and will be better illustrated in the table of org and benefits resolution when we bring that forward. But this is really effectively the position control and the changes between the departments, comparing the year-to-year changes. So with that, in addition to the position ads, we did look at salary and benefits. And I've put in parentheticals there that this is recommended for non-represented employees only. Up until recently, with the addition of the fire department, Victorville has traditionally been a non-represented. The only representation we've typically had has been with the fire department. And so we do have a recognized group in the fire department currently. I actually recognized the Victorville professional firefighters in early 2020. But at this point, we don't have a completed memorandum of understanding. It's something that we'll be able to continue to resume negotiations on starting July 1st is what I'm hoping for. So the recommendations that we're bringing forward that are included as a part of the budgeted costs are for the non-represented employees only. And so just to summarize, what you're going to see is a recommendation that includes a cost of living adjustment for the employees. You'll see healthcare benefit enhancement. You'll see reinstituting a couple of benefits that were offered prior to the recession, such as longevity pay recognition and a sick leave buyback program. And the sick leave buyback program is really intended to help stave off something similar to what we experienced recently with the annual leave program. And we did have an audit finding where the accrued annual leave balances were too high. And we're identifying that we could potentially run into a similarly natured issue on the sick leave accruals because the buyback program has been suspended for more than 10 years. One of the things that we've tracked with respect to COLA and what we're recommending in this fiscal budget and the numbers that are in front of you contain a COLA increase of 3.6%. The cost associated with that on the aggregate is $1.1 million. So one of the things that you'll see is how COLA has trended over the years. You'll actually see a few years where COLA has actually been foregone. And in fact, until the pandemic, I've been pretty open with everybody that I talked to prior to last year's fiscal year budget that I had intended to recommend a COLA for this current fiscal year this time last year. And of course, with the pandemic and the uncertainty that we're dealing with, we did have to choose at that time to forego that just until we can see how we survive this pandemic. But I can tell you, it feels like we can see in the numbers that we're surviving the pandemic fairly well. And so with that, we are recommending a 3.6% COLA CPI increase for the employees. Another issue that has become increasingly important, and we're starting to see where we're seeing some separations with employees. Employees are leaving the city. We've actually seen cases now where they've pointed to our fringe benefits not being valuable enough for them to stay. In fact, it's costing our employees a significant amount out of pocket to continue to work with us as compared to other agencies. And so one of the things that's actually contained on this particular slide is a summary of some. These are not all of the healthcare programs that we offer, but just to try to give some comparison. This one actually considers the Kaiser family rate, a dental rate, and a vision rate. But if you'll see, and we've highlighted in 2004, the second to last column, you'll actually see the average cost for family insurance. And in 2004, we highlighted that because that's effectively where we saw, we really started seeing the divergence in the cost from the fringe allowance that's offered to the employees. And so in that particular year, the fringe allowance that the city offered its employees was $626. And at the time, the average cost for that family program was about $782. And you can see from that year, that's when it really started to exponentially increase over time to where we're at right now. And the simplest comparison of where we're at right now is that the fringe allowance that employees are offered to use towards their medical benefits is $850. And the family insurance cost is for those illustrated here is $1,976, meaning that the employees are having to come out of pocket for the difference to fully cover their families. Of course, when you study these kinds of things, you want to take a look and compare yourself to other organizations just to make sure you're not doing something too far out of the norm, especially considering the conservative approach we take to budgets here. But this, I think this slide tells a lot with respect to where we compare, and it does validate to us what we're hearing when employees do leave and they're citing the cost of insurance being a contributing factor to why they're leaving to, say, another city. Of all these cities that we polled here, you can see clearly that we are the lowest of all cities in terms of the fringe allowance that's offered to the employees. And in some cases here, some of the cities actually are not even putting a value on the fringe. They're actually taking the position that it's their role as the organization to pay for the medical program of the employee plus family. So in some of these cases where we have asterisks, they're actually estimated values based upon that policy position that they have as organizations, where their benefit to the employee is going to be the health benefit for themselves and their family. This slide is intended to kind of break down those employees that are paying out of pocket. And so this pie chart is showing that 42 employees pay over $1,000 out of their pocket just to provide health care to their family. 66 employees pay between $500 and $999 out of pocket. And 50 employees pay under $500 out of pocket. So there's pretty meaningful amounts coming out of the employees' pockets that are taken away from their take-home pay. And so there are some employees that do cash out, and those would be employees that don't have a dependent or dependents, I should say. So in the case of the EE only, that means employee only, you can actually see where in their particular case, there's a cash out because the total cost for them individually is less than the actual fringe amount. But as you get to employee plus one, employee plus dependent, or employee plus two, which is the family, you can see where in those particular cases, the out-of-pocket cost is quite large. And sadly, the reality that we're experiencing is that's growing. That's an amount that's growing every year. This budget, when we first started looking at the budget, it was certainly the goal of management and the executive team to try to do everything we could to try to provide or take a position, make policy out of providing as a compensation benefit to the employees, health benefits to the employee and the family. That is, we're identifying as a little too costly for the city to absorb. But one of the scenarios that we came up with that we believe is meaningful to the employees and something that we can afford is a concept where, and that's what this budget includes, is a $50 increase to the fringe allowance, which doesn't sound like a lot, but it does increase the fringe allowance from $850 to $900. But it also then proposes to match dollar for dollar for the next $500 to really try to shrink that total out of pocket, especially for those that are paying for the employee plus the family. So effectively having a potential swing of $550 to those that are taking the family benefit. So with that, you can see the impact and just kind of illustrating between the two slides. Currently, a family is, an employee is coming out of pocket $1,125. If we were to implement this new program where we have an increase of the subsidy, an increase to the fringe, and then effectively match in the form of a subsidy up to $500, that same employee comes out of pocket instead of $1,125, they would come out of pocket $575. And that's based on current known costs. Just to get a sense of what this type of program costs to the city, just as we did with the COLA, this slide is to illustrate what that differential costs on a monthly basis. The program altogether, if we implement this, would cost an additional $1.06 million, almost $1.1 million of additional cost on the personnel side. So in summary, and again, this is to the non-represented employees, this slide is intended to kind of bring it together that between the COLA, the fringe benefit increase, the fringe benefit match, one thing that we're looking at, and I'll talk about in just a minute, is longevity pay. Those three themselves in the aggregate cost $2.3 million. The longevity pay is something that we identified earlier as wanting to reinstitute. We had a program up until I believe 2009. I think it was a fairly rich program. That's how I've characterized it. So what we've proposed is a longevity program that's restructured, but effectively recognizes longevity to employees that have been here 10 years or more. And effectively, upon 10 years of service with the city, provides a one-time payment once a year. Typically, it was done in the month of December, and that would be an amount of $50 per year of service. So for example, if you just reached your 10-year anniversary this year with the city, you'd be eligible for longevity pay at a $500 amount. So $50 times the 10 years. And that's really intended to be some form of recognition to say thank you and show an additional level of appreciation to those that really have been dedicating time with the city. And then finally, we are considering a sick leave buyback program. We have had that program suspended for 10 years, and what we've seen resulted from that program has been an accrual of sick leave balances to the point where I think similarly we've got to attend to it as we did with annual leave. So we're still putting the fine tuning on that program, so we don't exactly have a cost associated with that. But by the time we bring forward a final budget, we'll certainly have that program better defined and a cost attached to it. So getting into the particular funds, both the enterprise funds and the special funds. Here we've got focus on funds 410 and through 413. These are your water district funds. And on the aggregate basis, the water fund is looking at a $53.5 million revenue line with a $51.8 million expenditure line. It does show a surplus of revenue on the aggregate, which then goes to fund either capital reserves, operating reserves, or capital needs. And so with that, and you can identify, and this is probably one of your healthiest enterprise funds. In fact, it is your healthiest enterprise fund in the city. It's fully funded its OPEBs, it's fully funded its capital reserves, it's fully funded its operating reserves. It's a very well-run organization, and that's why you see available resources at the order of $46.4 million. This department, this enterprise does depend upon a rate plan. In fact, we're in the tail end of the rate planning process. We've shared with you recently the water master plan. We've also shared with you in a workshop setting the recent draft of the rate plan. So with that, this budget particularly does assume a rate increase of 3%. That was the number that was actually included in the rate plan that we presented to you a few weeks ago. We're actually intending on bringing that back to you for final approval to where then we can actually send out the ballots and the notices to the ratepayers to satisfy the protest election process. Sewer also is a rate funded program. We're actually showing in this particular case revenues in the order of 19.2 million over expenditures of 17.6. That's showing a surplus of cash with available resources for, again, operating reserves and capital of about $5.6 million. This particular fund does include a 10.9% rate increase, which is actually coupled by two large components. First, your rate plan for the sewer system, which is the collection system. That's the pipes that are in the ground. For your conveyance system, the rate plan has recommended 7.5%, but also it does assume a rate increase that's been approved by VVWRA, which is the regional sewer authority. They also have a rate plan supported rate increase built into their operations that does have to get passed through. And that would be about 3.4% of the total 10.9. So this budget does come forward with a recommended rate increase to be consistent with the approved rate plan. Solid waste also is another rate supported program. This is the one that I should identify, and we're fairly pleased with where it's at currently, because in early 2018, this was the fund that we identified, I believe it was in February of 2018. We actually started cash flow modeling this fund, and it was before cash flows were being done for this fund. We were actually projecting this fund literally running out of cash in September of 2018. Which sounded the alarm. Of course, there was a rate plan completed. And so with that, what we're pleased about is you've actually got this fund in a position now where it has built up its cash so it can sustain itself. And with that, your solid waste fund is drawing a revenue of about $20.2 million against operations of $19.9 million. Small surplus on the operating basis, but there is a contribution there too. To your cash balance. The street lighting fund. This is a fund that we established, I believe it was in 2015 or 2016, and effectively this is ratepayer supported as well. I'm sorry, it's a property tax assessed a rate that's paid by property owners. So this is going to be your residences, this is going to be your businesses. And the rate that's currently in place is $13.98 per EDU. That's the same identical rate that was imposed back in 2015 or 2016 when this was first approved. So the street lighting fund has not seen any rate increases over its time, and it wasn't determined that it was necessary until this fiscal year as we're cash flowing forward. So this budget does include a recommended rate increase of 10%. Sounds like a lot, but it's an amount equal to about $1.40 per year, which would take effectively on the EDU basis or the property basis, a charge of $13.98 to $15.38 per EDU per year. So an EDU, I think the easiest way to characterize it on a residential basis is a home, for example, is an EDU. So even though it sounds like a big number on the 10%, over the course of an entire year, it's only $1.40. Storm drain fund, this is one that we've got to continually watch. We're always very conservative with this particular fund. Certainly, we have a number of washes, a number of storm drains throughout the city. This is one where I can tell you it certainly doesn't generate nearly enough revenue that's necessary to support the quote system if we were able to define what the system was. And so we're looking at ways. This is one fund where we'll continue to look for ways to generate additional revenue so that we can expand our operations and maintenance of the actual storm drain system. SCLA operations. These are funds 450 and fund 452 and 455. It looks like a big budget, and it is largely because it has a dependency upon pass-through revenue to satisfy the debt service that it has in place to have paid for a lot of the public infrastructure out there at SCLA. A lot of that public infrastructure is yielding the successful economic development that you've seen over the years and that you're going to see in years to come. But effectively, you do see revenues outpacing the expenditures to the point where you're actually, again, able to put funds in operations at the airport. VMIS, this one is also a large operation out at the airport principally, but you also have an electric operation out at the Foxborough Industrial Park, which is Nisqually and Hesperia Roads. A small electric operation out there, but you've got a total budget here of $19.7 million against expenditures of $18.8 million. You're showing a surplus. There's a big capital spend. That capital spend is associated with the upgrade of capacity out at SCLA. There's a need to increase the capacity so that we can continue to service customers out there. The utility is proposing a 16% rate increase. That is a lot, and that is directly reflective of what is going on in the energy market. We haven't completed our pricing yet for our power in the upcoming fiscal year. We should secure that power probably Wednesday of next week is when I've been asked to be by the phone and ready to strike. But the power market, the commodity particularly, I think we're staring at potentially 2 times our current cost. The market has just been unstable for the last 12 months. And that's actually going to be carried through. We see it at the retail level and at the distribution level as a utility, but across the board, everybody is going to see large increases for the consumption of electric power. And I think it's important to note, and just as a reminder, when it comes to the Victorville municipal utility, the electric services, the gas services that we provide, none of that service is for residential customer. That's 100% for industrial customers. So it does not affect the residents. And finally, the budget contains a lot of capital improvement projects. Certainly, you've got a number out at the airport. I'm particularly excited on this sheet for the ones that are identified in parks. It's been very difficult over the years to invest like we are into our parks facilities. I'm partial to the track lighting at Hook Park. It's certainly going to expand. I think I really would characterize it as actually maximizing the use of that particular facility. The Hook track is a grass field. This would propose to add some stadium lights so that we can get some expanded use, whether it's for soccer or football. And even though it's not in this budget, Ms. Davidson and I are talking about other improvements to that facility, such as modernizing the actual track component and perhaps even the field component to make it more desirable. But the lighting in itself would give us additional usage for recreational sports, youth sports particularly. But we also believe just the lighting in itself will help enhance or create a greater sense of safety at that facility. We're also considering in this budget design and construction cost for a dog park, which based upon the feedback we've gotten from the community is a priority. So we will be attending to that with this budget. Thank you, Measure P. And we are going to study to build some connectivity between our communities by building some walking paths and walking trails. But at least in this particular budget, we'll be studying those elements. The actual construction would be forthcoming. We'll continue with CIP. I think the big one here, of course, everything under sewer is all part of the master plan. So that's just progressing with the recommended improvements in the sewer master plan. SCLA capacity upgrades we've talked about. That's a big heavy lift that originally at the start of the year we talked about financing. We're still considering the financing, but right now because of some of the power costs and the power contracts that we're trying to negotiate, it's delayed any outside financing. So we're actually moving forward with those capacity upgrades, relying on available cash. Got a number of water improvements. One of the things here that I will identify, and it was one of those nice surprises that Police Chief Wickham brought to my attention, and that was, hey, do you know that there's such a thing called the Supplemental Law Enforcement Services Fund? I didn't know anything about it, but apparently we had this fund in our system, and it had money in it, and had quite a bit of money in it. And the question was, can we use it to make upgrades to some of our systems? So in this particular case, not being charged a Measure P would be an expansion of the existing ALPR system. As you know, we've invested quite heavily thus far to our existing system of 57 ALPR cameras. This budget would add another 50. We're calling it phase 4 and 5. Streets are a big deal. One of the items that's not included in here, and we'll celebrate it next week, the ribbon cutting for the Green Tree extension into Apple Valley. That's a major project that'll last for about 23, 24 months. But in addition to that, you've got a major slurry seal project proposed here in the Civic Center area. 7th Avenue is a major pavement improvement project that we're taking on. Bear Valley Road. This is a stretch that this council has been approached for many years with complaints over the stretch between Amethyst on Bear Valley, westerly towards 395. And so this budget would finally attend to that last segment on Bear Valley Road and do a major rehab on that section of road. Arrowhead Drive and of course the Bear Valley Bridge. Number of equipment purchases beyond capital. And one of the things I've highlighted on my notes here is just the common phrase replacement. And with this budget, we're actually able to find ourselves in a position, especially for pieces of equipment where it's become increasingly costly to maintain, to the point where we're spending more than what the value is of the assets. This budget does allow us to start replacing some older equipment. We slightly touched on the Type 1 engines, but we will also be able to invest in additional CPR devices to make sure to do our best to outfit each of the apparatus that is rolling on Victorville streets to have CPR devices available. There's a need for a mobile command unit in the police department, enhancements at our library with locker systems. And I think looking forward, because there's been a heavy focus on just meeting the goals of this council and attending to the priorities that have been laid out. I think we're doing something right as a city because we're starting to see quite a bit of economic development activity. The Amazon last mile delivery stations under construction, Chick-fil-A, for those of you that like chicken, and I am now a fan because I've tried it out and I will go regularly. That's a pretty good place. So I'm looking forward to Chick-fil-A opening up. CarMax is progressing quite well. Hotels, we should see those 3 hotels moving forward. One of the things that's nice about hotel facilities is that they generate a form of revenue in what we call TOT, or transient occupancy tax. So each time we see a hotel come in, I think that's what's directly attributing to why you're seeing such strong increases on the TOT revenue side. Do have a new hotel proposed. There it is. Marriott's building a new 96 room at the northwest corner of Mariposa Road in Cottonwood. We've got some small restaurant shops coming in at the crossroads over at 395 and Palmdale. I'm really excited about this, and I believe it's going to happen, but we have entitlements in place, and we're actually getting plans in for 3 large industrial warehouse facilities out at the airport, totaling approximately 2.4 million square feet of industrial space. That's largely on the west side of the airport, west of and north of the existing Dr. Pepper Snapple site. So going to see some meaningful industrial development that should add at least $120 million worth of new assessed valuation to that area. SCLA continues to be strong beyond warehouse manufacturing. Aerospace is strong. We're continuing to hold strong with our occupancy rate, and hoping to achieve 100% occupancy of those facilities that are leasable. This one's a redundant slide, so I'm going to jump through that one. And one of the things that we've got on the horizon that we're looking at, we are still nearing the completion of a diff and user fee study. We've been many years behind in keeping up with the costs associated with development impact fees, or even the cost to do things such as plan check or undertake inspections. So that's something that's forthcoming that will be a revenue opportunity, or at least an opportunity to try to recapture the actual costs associated with the service that we're providing at the counter. This budget does not include, though we are expecting $33.5 million available to us through the American Rescue Plan Act. Many of us are actually reading through it right now, trying to understand it. I think I'm on page 80 of a 150-page document. It's very involved, but that's something that we're studying. And to the extent we actually have expenditures eligible to program against that, we will bring that back in the form of additional appropriation. There's some federal funding infrastructure that we're looking at once the federal government chooses to act on some of the infrastructure spending bills that they're looking at. And then also one of the things to look forward to, not in this budget yet, but we feel fairly confident about securing home key funding to help build our wellness and recuperative care facility. Where we're at on that project is we're in the design phase of that. We're actually progressing towards the environmental side, which is satisfying the CEQA and NEPA environmental processes. So we're hopeful that we'll be able to bring something back to you in the form of additional appropriation, both on the revenue expense side for the Wellness and Recuperative Care Center. And finally, I think even though this is, for us, it's been exciting because I think Measure P has helped solve a lot of our issues. I think We've seen enough revenue growth in a number of the other funds to present this budget to you and be excited about it. We did want to share with you still that we've got to be very conservative in our approach, that even though Measure P has been approved, it's not the answer. There was a slide earlier that actually showed a deficit spend. So we're going to have to continue to look for alternative ways to fund to make sure that we can continue to keep up with the actual increases in cost over time. And so with that, that is our budget presentation. Thank you for hanging in there through this long presentation. But I think it would have been much longer had we started the presentation by asking you to start at page 1 and then flipping through page by page through the entire budget. But we're certainly available for any detailed questions or comments you might have. You have the executive team here at the dais. You have the leadership team here in the audience. You have key staff here. I think we can answer pretty much any question that you have for us. And if we can't, we can certainly bring back an answer. And then finally, what I envision from today, there's certainly no action required today. But between now and June 15th, we're currently envisioning June 15th being the targeted date to actually approve a budget. And I would say between now and then would be the opportunity to dialogue, and to the extent there's any questions or additional interests council has, we'd use that time to revise the budget and bring it forward in a format that the council is ready to approve.
Thank you, Mr. Metzler, for a very detailed and well thought out presentation. It's very helpful. In fact, as we were going along, I was making a list of a lot of questions, wanting examples of capital improvement projects that are ahead of us, and you answered that later on in the presentation. So thank you for that, certainly. All right, so now we're going to open it up to technical questions from council members. We're going to begin with Council Member Gomez, and we have 5 minutes of questions. You're on, Member Gomez.
Okay, I would like to state that for the last few years, I have not had the opportunity to get any staff member, let alone the city manager, to answer any of my questions. Those privileges, unfortunately, were suspended for obvious reasons, so I need to make that a part of the record. My first question
Member
is,
Gomez, will you pause for just a
would
moment?
you suspend my time? Thank you.
Thank you for saying that. So just so we know with this new system, and I hope you can, I don't know if you can see it on the clock, but the clerk knows, Member Gomez and my other colleagues, that whenever I have to interject a thought or make a parliamentary rule, the clerk knows to go ahead and stop the clock so that your time is certainly reserved. But to the extent that council member is concerned with not having received information, my understanding, and it has been for years, is that council member has always been had agenda review prep made available to her. Why it doesn't work out, I think, is largely the onus is on Councilmember Gomez. So with that said, Member Gomez, I would like to ask you to stay on the item as to the questions on the presentation. You may proceed.
I object to what you said. It's self-serving bias and you have an overexposed ego.
Member Gomez, you're not making a point of order, but you're free to do one. If you would like to make a point of order, please let me know.
My question starts with looking at the line items. It's obviously academically by research has been confirmed. When we use line items, it is to hide things. So my question is, what funding sources cover the revenues for the golf course? It's not delineated there. And why did the author of this item leave out the disclaimer that says that this special revenue fund does not solely rely on revenues generated through their respective business operations to cover the operating expenses? And what does such a disclaimer do for the reader? It was left out of this one for sure.
Okay, so let's take up that question, and just to make this easy for everyone, all of the questions will be assumed to be put to Mr. Metzler, and then Mr. Metzler, you're free to send that off to any member of your team if you'd like to.
Thank you, Madam Mayor and members of the council. As to the question about the funding source for the golf course, that has been included as a part of the overall Park and Recreation program. Ms. Davidson oversees those divisions. Ms. Davidson, do you know the fund number for the golf, where the golf course would be funded out of?
420.
The golf course is funded from the general fund, Fund 100.
Fund 100 is the answer.
Yeah, let me reframe that question because obviously that's not what I wanted to know. What I was asking is, if you look at page 80, you will start to notice that it is speculative that we're only spending $15,000 on an item that costs the city of Victorville over $1 million. And so I'm concerned that the city of Victorville has not placed under this a disclaimer showing that there are other funding sources, water and anything else that would cover that. And so I'm just trying to be more transparent for the community to realize that we're not just spending $15,000 on that item.
Okay, so for clarification, Member Gomez, I think, is referring to a page number found in our budget book and not the presentation that the council has before it. I understand Member Gomez has not picked that packet up. So I guess we're going to have to go to the budget book to answer that question.
I do have the budget book and I do have page 80. And what Ms. Gomez is referring to is Fund 400 that is no longer being used. In fact, that fund hasn't been used for several years. In fact, the last fiscal budget that used that fund was the 18-19 fiscal year. We have modified the way we operate the golf course, and instead of accounting for it separately, because there was really very little reason to continue to do that, we actually fund that no differently than we fund all of our parks. Just as a golf course is a park itself, we fund that out of the parks program, which is all and has all been funded out of the general fund, which is Fund 100.
Okay, Member Gomez, do you have other questions?
Well, thank you for that clarification because the city council budget workshop, May 27, 2021, 5 o'clock is documentation that I have up to date that all council members received. So I was taking that as up to date, but if it's not up to date, thank you for the clarification. My next question is, in the capital improvement program, there's different totals of allocations. I want to know, when did Measure P Oversight Board have discussions of the allocations? There's nearly $2 million of allocations that we can start seeing. Is this the proposition that was going to be coming to the city council in the near future? And what's the purpose of the oversight board if we've already pre-allocated the dollar amount? If you want a page number, I'm more than happy to supply that.
Thank you, Madam.
Mr. Metzler, can you hold on just a moment? Member Gomez, I don't know. We're hearing a bit of background noise, and I don't know if it's coming from your end or not. So if on the chance that it is, could you mute your mic while your questions are being answered? Thank you, Mr. Metzler.
Thank you, Madam Mayor, members of the council. So in October, I believe it was, the city council adopted a resolution that effectively required an oversight board to be put in place, anticipating Measure P's approval. Had Measure P not passed, there would have been no need for the oversight board committee. And the reason for the approval of the resolution forming the oversight board committee was really intended to establish an independent body to be able to review budgets and make recommendations to this council that what's contained in the budget, such as the one before you, actually contains a proposal of expenditures that are consistent with the intent. That resolution also requires that the oversight board also be responsible once the city has closed out its books and conducted its independent audit. The oversight board is set up to review that particular fund. And in this particular case, that's why we created a separate fund 105, which is to make it easier to see the actual expenditures against that particular fund. And so those are effectively the two purposes for the oversight board. Answering the question as to when it met to review effectively what you're seeing in this budget today. It was a meeting of May 20th at 5 p.m. That's when it actually reviewed all of the expenditure documents that are before you. At that meeting, it actually authorized a letter to be submitted to this council, which will be contained in your final budget book. But they effectively have reviewed and determined that what's in this book here meets the intent of Measure P.
Okay, so going back to page 109 for the code enforcement compliance, $180,000, F-450s, $85,000, F-250 crew cab pickup, $65,000, and so on, ending to type 1 fire engine truck with $1.6 million. You're saying that on May 20th at 5 o'clock, this was reviewed?
Those items were contained in the Measure P program before the Oversight Board Committee, yes.
Thank you for the clarification. How much funding does Fund 400 receive from Funds 410, 11, 12, and 13, and also 630?
Did you say Fund 400?
Yes.
Is Fund 400 the golf course? The answer is 0.
And is the $34 million 100% of the cost that the city pays for? At what funding sources are enabled besides the general fund, which is 42 when you include fire, when you include Measure P being 18%? Where are we getting those figures when we look at $34 million?
I can't answer that until I get an answer from you as to the question of where you're getting the $34 million figure from.
The police gets paid $34 million. Page 55 is for your reference.
Yes, so the police department summary, that is being funded either from general fund or from Measure P. That would be cash. There's no bonds to pay that.
And my follow-up question to that is, why was there was a lack of funding source claimed on this one? And I figured we were doing Measure P and general fund, but I didn't want to guess that. Is there a reason why the funding mechanism source was not delineated in this page?
That is because you're looking at a basic revenue and expenditure summary of the department. The police department is not set up to generate its own revenues. It does not have services that it sells that generates revenues. And that's why it depends on the general fund from the city to actually pay for the services that they provide to the residents.
You look at different other departments and they have the funding source within its page. So I didn't know what the rationale for that one was. Again, looking at the subtopics in blue bold for each of the categories, why isn't there a tab to briefly describe the summary of the purpose of each topic? So for instance, you could look at asset seizure forfeiture or asset seizure funds. I don't know what that means. A lot of our members who were doing this are not going to understand the technicality. And I'm just wondering why there wasn't something within the tab to explain each one of them.
Yes, I'm sorry, Madam Mayor, members of the council. Yes, so I think if you'll draw attention, if you're not already attended to page 57, at the very bottom of that chart, that does identify the funding sources to achieve the $34.128 million budget. And you'll see clearly in there, consistent with what I just shared with you, that the lion's share of that is funded from Measure P from sales tax. There's a few other funding sources in there, such as grants. But as you point out, asset seizure, whether it's federal or state, my understanding is that those are smaller, much smaller revenue amounts that are effectively divvied up from either the state or federal level associated with basically deriving cash from the seizure of assets perhaps associated with crime. And effectively, those are distributed almost as a grant to communities, in the case of the state of California, to cities, or from the federal government to states and then to cities.
Let me clarify the question. This question was not pertinent to the funding source. This question is for every single line item or every single subtopic highlighted in blue: police department summary, engineering, public works, economic development. I wanted to understand why we didn't have someone place a tab that gave a brief description of what these things mean in terms of understanding what we're looking at. That was my question.
Well, I certainly didn't understand the question that way. And I think that's why we're here, is to be able to answer some of those questions for you. The final budget book will actually include some acronyms as well to help better explain some of the things that have acronyms. But other than what we have here, if something like federal asset seizure isn't clear, certainly we can clarify that. But if we were to try to put an explanation to every single fund, we could probably turn this book into a 1,000-page document.
I think it helps for transparency. And just to clarify, I looked at the acronyms. There is 0 acronyms, and I have several things that are underlined for acronyms, which I don't have a clue what they mean. It's tabbed in, but it's not explained. So thank you for bringing that up. My next question is for the capital improvement projects.
Your
why it
time
only
is up.
50? Thank you.
Thank you, Member Gomez. All right, so I don't know, I'm seeing a few signals perhaps that maybe a point of privilege is in order. Is anyone else in the room feeling warm?
Yes.
We have 2. Okay, we have a few. So I'm wondering if anyone can do anything about that. I'm fine, but I don't count because
I think someone turned.
I'm
on
always
there.
cool.
I just
Okay.
felt it go on.
okay,
Sounds like it just kicked in.
very good. All right, thank you very much. All right. Member Becerra, we're going to move on with you. For your
Thank you very
question.
much. Mr. Metzler, thank you to you and your team. I just like to bring it out that last year's budget was $265.4 million with $32.4 million shortfall. This year's budget is 293.7 with 5 million more into capital funds and with a 3.4 million in revenue. So on our side, thank you very much for that. I'd like to tell you guys that. My next thing is your page 9 on the book you gave us. Operations and maintenance, 40%. Those are the day-to-day operations for everybody across the board, correct?
Oh, I'm sorry, the presentation.
All my questions
Yes,
are going to reference that one.
that is an aggregate representation, so the answer is yes.
Okay. Page 14. The general fund reserves, you'd like us to keep it at 17.92 million. If we do that, does that help the credit standing of the city of Victorville?
I can't answer that with certainty, but I do believe it definitely would be looked upon favorably. In fact, some of the feedback that we got when we actually were working with the credit agencies was recognition that we were able to maintain 15% as being positive, and the fact that we actually cash flow and project forward the way we do for all funds, but particularly the general fund, that was also looked upon very favorably. So I have to believe increasing the reserve from 15 to 17%, especially because it's not being done arbitrarily. It's being done based upon a method to determine what cash is needed for it to stand on its own. I think that would be viewed very favorably.
Okay, thank you on that. Also on page 20. I understand the positions. If the positions can be looked after in looking at your CIP for expanding our parks, we're going to add water pads in a lot of our parks.
Splash pads?
Yeah, splash pads. And then
Yeah.
you want to upgrade hook and everything. I seen 0 positions for parks. An FYI.
Yeah, and this is where I think some of the roll up and or some of the reorg that we've done probably doesn't show very clearly. So I guess speaking to the parks, we did realign the parks division into public works. Janelle, are you familiar with the number of positions there?
Yes, in the budget before you this evening, the only positions added for parks are 2 additional part-time positions. Those are intended to take on some of the maintenance associated with LMADs and address some of the deferred maintenance. Any capital projects are most likely to be completed under contract.
But after that, we're going to take care of them, correct?
Correct.
Okay, thank you. Page 34, sir. The water funds. So for the projects stated for next year, $46 million in projects, that is included in the 53 million, correct?
The 46 million
Fund.
at the very bottom.
Yeah.
That's available resources. So we would compare that to cash. And so that particular item would largely be comprised of your capital reserve, which we set a capital reserve target of 3% of net asset value. So we take a valuation of the entire system and establish a reserve based upon that at 3%. So we fund that particular level, whatever that calculation comes out to be. It also includes an operating reserve. And so we calculate an operating reserve for the water district at 90 days operating cash. And then there is a large OPEB reserve where we're actually funded 100%. So we don't have any unfunded liability with the OPEB for the water district. And OPEB, for those in the audience, I'm sorry, for the public members don't know, that's the other post-employment benefits such as retirement benefits that are offered for retirees after they retire from the city.
Those 46 million in reserves, those aren't included in our 3.5 million then at the end of the year, because that's a special fund, correct?
3.5 million, I'm sorry.
At the end for page 8, page 8. We have 3.4 million in reserves. That's not going to be included in all our special funds. They have their own reserves.
Let me get to page 8. I'm tracking you. So yes, and this is where this is an aggregate representation. So certainly, I'm sorry, the 3.4 is just a net revenue number. So it's likely that there's a component inside that 3.4 that could go into the reserve for the water district. Let me go back. What was that water district page that you were on? 34. So seeing that on page 34, yeah, in theory, because you can see that there's a surplus of 1.7 of that 3.4, in theory, you could say 1.7 of that could be going to supplement the water fund reserve.
Okay. Page 46. I see we're buying a lot of vehicles. Good. Have we looked into electric vehicles with, I know we can't believe everything they say, with everything the governor's saying, we're going to go electric. Are we starting to go electric?
We have not officially started looking at it, but we are very much interested in it, especially with the mandates. We're very much aware of that. So we are going to start evaluating the potential to start transitioning our fleet.
Okay.
But it is not contemplated in this budget.
And then one last question, if I can get through it. For SCLA, page 52, the proposed buildings we want to build, I know you said 2 million for. Are those to bring businesses, or those are businesses that are already chomping at the bit with us?
All three of those facilities are to house tenants. There's actually
Not gonna sit
tenants.
empty.
I'm sorry?
They're not gonna sit empty.
No, there are tenants identified for each of those three buildings. They just haven't been, the names of them just have not been released publicly.
Cool. And then last one, page 53,
53?
possible federal infrastructure funding. Are these for FHWA roads or FEMA roads?
I don't believe they're FEMA roads. Mr. Gangler, are you tracking some of the federal infrastructure bills and have any sense perhaps of what they may go towards if approved?
Are you referring to possible additional grant funds that may be available?
Federal spending bills, there's an infrastructure bill that I know that they're contemplating, I'm not aware that they've approved it yet.
Yeah, I have not researched that, so I don't know what additional federal grants might be available.
If you need help, let me know.
Say that
Yes.
again?
That's it, Mr. Metzger.
Okay.
Thank you very much. Very well put together.
Thank you.
Thank you. No more further questions.
Thank you, Member Becerra. Mayor Pro Tem, do you have questions?
I have a few questions. So first of all, I'd like to say that I'm sure this has been a very busy time, especially for staff and finance. So I want to say thank you, Mr. Metzler, to you and your team for putting in the hard work and for this wonderful presentation. My questions, this is a lot of information, so I'm going to have to say that I'm probably going to read over it several times to digest it in detail. But certainly by listening to your presentation, I do have a few questions that come to mind. First of all, you spoke about the non-represented represented employees, and you spoke about a particular unit that we have that is represented, but we have not entered into negotiations. Did I hear that? Did I understand it correctly?
Well, we have entered into negotiations. We have not completed negotiations. And so we're talking about the Victorville Professional Firefighters, VPF. And they organized officially around March or April of 2020. That's about when I recognized them as an official unit. But we have been working with them on an MOU. As of the end of March, we were not able to come to terms, and we had to put a pause on those negotiations so that we can focus on this budget. And that's why we're hoping that after the budget's approved, starting July 1st, we can resume those discussions and try to get an MOU passed.
So those discussions in no way there, you have not factored into this budget, those discussions or where they may lead,
What we have,
impact our budget.
what we have done as a part of the budget is we have made assumption. And we have included in the total fire cost assumptions of benefit and COLA, for example, identical to that we're recommending to the city staff. But because it's not memorialized, I think we're hopeful that that's where we end up. But to the extent that there's something more that they negotiate for and we come to terms with, it could have an additional impact on the budget.
Okay. The other thing that piqued my interest and leads to my next question, I heard you speak about our employees. And so the fringe benefits really sticks out for me. I saw that we did a comparison of all the cities in our region, in our area. But in that comparison, are we comparing ourselves to cities with similar budgets? I saw Adelanto. The reason I'm asking is I'm assuming that when you came with the recommendations of the $500 subsidy and the increase in $50, that's based on a study, that recommendation. Is there anything that we can do to enhance? We pay for the talent that we get, bottom line. And the most valuable resource to me is the human resource. So have we really we got all the juice from the lemon? You understand what I'm asking?
I do. And, we we have looked, I think with what we're offering, it's certainly taking a major hit. It's actually providing a major benefit. But of course, what we ultimately wanted when we did the cash flows, we did get concerned, especially as those costs continue year over year. When we were modeling, we were trying to be as conservative as possible. So at least in what we looked at and comparing our city, in what we looked at and what we recommended and comparing our city and the nature of our city and the complexity of our city to others, we believe it's much more fair, of course, than where we're at. Certainly, I'd like to be able to do more. But with that, I think what we have in front of us certainly is a pretty big step.
I understand. I just support staff. So the last thing that I wanted to say is I'm very happy about the hook track lighting because I use that track, especially nowadays. I'm hitting the track a little more often since we've come out of the restrictions for the pandemic. So those enhancements to the parks, I'm happy to see those. And I'm also really excited about the intellectual or intelligent lockers. Is that the appropriate term? Those things are good. I'm glad to see that that's in the budget. The last thing I wanted to ask, and I was kind of hoping to see something, and maybe I'll save this question for another time, but I was concerned about the lighting, the lighting fund. Does it, or any of these capital, it is on the horizon, anything about lighting in the Old Town region area?
There is capital. We have been attending to the Old Town area. I know we've invested in adding lighting to a lot of the intersections where there's alleyways, for example. Mr. Gangler oversees the street lighting fund and is much more familiar. There is an item in there for streetlights in Old Town, but I think Mr. Gangler, the city engineer, would be best. I think it is important enough to highlight that because we are planning on making some improvements down there. So I'd invite Mr. Gangler to summarize what the street lighting for Old Town is going to be.
Hi, Mr. Gangler. How are you?
Yeah, we have $100,000 in next year's budget proposed for street lighting at Old Town. And so the street lighting is pretty much caught up at the intersections. The areas that are deficient are 7th Street between Forest and D Street, because that has those decorative type lighting. And then also that decorative lighting and some stretches along D Street between I-15 and 11th Street. There are deficient areas there. So we do plan to upgrade the streetlights in that area with standard lighting. We looked at having a different type of lighting that was more consistent with these Old Town specific plan. However, that was a very expensive project.
Right.
So we would need another funding source. So what we're proposing is just to put standard lighting in there to upgrade those 2 streets. And then we would be pretty much done with Old Town after that. Everything else would be meeting our standards.
Okay, thank you very much. Aside from those questions, Mr. Metzler, I'd like to commend you and your staff on a job well done. Thank you very much for the presentation.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mayor Pro Tem. All right, I do have a few questions. First of all, let me just make a quick comment. I love the fact that we have now our vision, mission, and goals tied to our strategic action plan, which is now tied. They all marry well together for a comprehensive package for our city. So I love the approach for sure. Okay, just a couple of concerns on the budget assumptions. That's slide number 6. You're presuming that your 2021 sales tax levels are sustained. But this past year has been a little bit different in terms of the revenues that we've gotten, I think largely because of online buying. And as things change and open up more, I mean, are we just presuming that people are going to stay with the new normal of online buying? And are we projecting too much revenue in that area?
Thank you, Madam Mayor, and members of the council. That is a good question. And we actually feel pretty good about the estimates. We do believe that there's likely going to be some waiver back to brick and mortar. I don't necessarily think it's going to be a huge difference in the aggregate sense of the revenue, because I think what we're seeing is a large reflection of spending capacity of residents and visitors. One thing that occurred, I believe it was last year, was finally there was a Supreme Court ruling called the Wayfair decision, and that actually became a windfall of sales tax revenue, not just for us, but for a lot of other communities. And it was identified that funding, that supplement to the sales tax line is very much expected to continue because it actually provided much more point of source for online sales. For example, online sales that occurred outside the state, they've gotten much better in being able to identify that and make sure that if the point of sale was really occurring to Victorville, that the pass-through of that sales tax will go to Victorville. So we saw a nice surprise bump last year that we're actually expecting to carry forward. But the numbers, we look at them quarterly with our sales tax consultant, HDL. We monitor them very, very closely. We're confident with the numbers that we have, but we certainly have the ability to pivot if we have to, since we review those so closely, and to the extent we see some trend different than the trend that we're seeing, we can come back to the council and bring that to your attention. And the fact that we rely on these models and we keep these cash flow models fresh, we can also adjust on the expense side too, if necessary.
Right, and then on slide number 14, on the 15 versus 17% general fund reserve forecast. And so this is pretty sobering that we really need to be at 17 to keep pace with our forecasted expenditures. What would the council need to do to formalize increasing the reserve requirements from 15 to 17%?
Thank you, Madam Mayor. That's actually a very good question. And we've actually thought that through. And the vision that we have is, unless the council has any issue and has any issue with us carrying forward that recommendation, our vision is to include that policy as a part of the final budget document. So it'd be one of the included action items that you'd be approving with your budget.
All right, and then so now talking about Measure P a little bit, if we go to slide number 17. So if we look at the out year of 25, 26, that's when we're looking at beginning deficit spending. And this is based, I would imagine, on the projections of our sales tax being very robust. Is that a fair statement?
The sales tax projection that we used, was it 4%? Or was that total? That was total revenue. What did we use for sales tax, 1 or 2%?
Okay.
So we actually came in across the board on both Measure P and the sales tax at 1.5. So that's a fairly conservative projected revenue increase. And as you can see, if you were to calculate it, the expenditures are tracking much higher. And that's why this is almost somewhat similar in concept to what we were staring at last year when we didn't have Measure P and we were just looking at the general fund. And I think the point in showing this, of course, is to show that Measure P isn't the answer for it all. However, if we can achieve higher than 1.5% sales tax rate, that could extend out or delay that deficit spend. It also is telling us, and really was intended to fit into that other statement, to where we need to look at other revenue sources. I'll give you an example, one that we had looked at many years ago. It made sense to do it. The voters didn't approve it, But the transient occupancy tax, the TOT, also called a bed tax. And we track at probably the lowest rate in the entire county of San Bernardino at 7%. It's not uncommon for cities to be in the order of 10% for TOT. And especially as we're seeing more and more hotels built, that's certainly one that we'll be looking at closely. I don't foresee it anytime in the immediate future because it looks like we're doing okay. But I think that speaks to the point that we were trying to make is as we can see forward and say a year 25-16, and if these projections hold true, we'll probably be coming back to you maybe in a year or two before that to start saying, hey, we might need to think about some alternatives so that we can sustain our general fund revenues.
All right, so then talking a little bit more about Measure P, when you presented that very comprehensive public safety report some time back, the purpose of that really was to help the council and the people understand where we were in terms of public safety, because there were a lot of concerns about response times and crime rates and all of the various issues that we've had for years in Victorville. And so it was not only to really identify where we were, but what it would take to get from being what we presumed was all behind the curve, and we certainly were behind the public safety curve, to get us to that place where we were being proactive so that our community could feel safer. But when we look at some of these numbers and we can see in some of the years going forward, are we actually saying that Measure P might not sustain that goal?
I think it is safe to say that it might not be enough.
Well, I guess I want to try to understand that, because when we did the projections at the time, it was based on 15 million, and now we're looking at numbers, on the order of, $18 million in revenue generated from Measure P. Is that due in large part to the rising costs of public safety?
It is due in part to that. One of the things that we did not contemplate in the public safety plan, because the public safety plan really was intended to focus on what are the service levels, what are the issues, and how do we try to change the course of that or the direction of that. And of course, the best funding source to try to tackle that was Measure P. But as we dealt with the fund challenges of realizing now you got a revenue source and you've got to try to prudently budget for it, one of the things that we identified as we were, and this is actually baked into the numbers in the public safety plan, it's just not called out very clearly. But one of the things that we realize is, for example, if we're focusing on police for 2 seconds, one of the things that we realize, if we were to try to achieve, say, for example, the identified 30 bodies in the police department, that's what we called out. And we relied solely upon Measure P to get us there. One of the things that was occurring if we did that is while we're perhaps able to fund the 30 deputies out of Measure P, it actually neglected our ability on the general fund side, Fund 100, to maintain the level of service that is relied upon from the general fund to fund. So saying it differently, you have two different funds. You have Measure P funding, say, the 30 new folks, but say under the general fund, you've got, I think the number I used was 130 bodies under the current year Schedule A. What we were seeing was an issue and just was not going to work is if we wanted to successfully achieve the 30 bodies under Measure P, the 5%, 6% cost increase under the general fund for the existing Schedule A, that expenditure would outpace the revenue growth on the general fund side to the point where we might have our 30 deputies over here funded by Measure P, but you may be staring at the general fund saying we can't continue to afford the baseline 130 deputies, if that makes sense. So that's where there had to be some kind of interrelationship between the two, because you didn't want to fund in one area and potentially have to be deficient in the other. So there was some balance to where Measure P in this budget includes a concept to where you're actually using Measure P funds to pay for what we call a maintenance level, maintaining that 130, if that makes sense. So at least what we have going forward is a plan that allows us to maintain existing service levels and invest in an expanded service level. But I can tell you with that structure in place, it's going to be very difficult unless we see some dramatic increases in both the sales and Measure P funds. That's why I say confidently that it will be difficult to achieve that 30.
So that is a disappointment, truly, I think probably to all of us, because our expectations for this were very high, and frankly, they still are. So when we kind of look at this in the I guess in a very general way, when we think about if Measure P comes in and we're able to fund things through that we would normally fund through that we would normally take care of through the general fund, one would think that would take off some of the pressure from the general fund. But your explanation in terms of law enforcement, that isn't necessarily the case.
Relying on Measure P to
Right.
maintain some of that service level does take pressure off the general fund.
Okay. All right, so then going on, because I don't want to run out of time, on slide number 27, on the, talking about the fringe benefits, and all of those slides prior to that were very helpful, and I certainly agree with really everything that Mayor Pro Tem said on this, but I do have a question. On this slide, it talks about how much in the various cities that our cities are giving toward the cost of healthcare. But is that on the presumption that the cost of healthcare is the same in every region? I mean, don't insurance companies base their rates differently on different regions based on the risks that are there?
I can't speak.
So is it like a dollar for dollar comparison here?
We are making dollar for dollar comparisons where those cities similar to us establish a dollar amount to serve as the fringe towards healthcare. There are a couple where they don't establish a dollar amount and instead just take the position that they're going to provide healthcare for the family. So in a few of these cases, we actually had to imply or calculate a value based upon their policy position of providing that healthcare benefit, and we established a value based upon the charges we know that are charged here in Victorville.
Okay. Well, it's quickly becoming the case, and I think everybody recognizes that benefits are an extremely important part of a package for taking care of our employees. So to the extent that we can assist in that, I'm certainly for it. Is this sustainable for us? I mean, if presuming that, because we still are down on the number of employees significantly from where we were, a number of years ago, right? And so
Your time is up.
there you go. All right. So I will hold my other questions for the June 15th meeting.
Would you like me? There was one question that you got in there. I
Yes,
can
could
answer
you-
that one
yes,
question. So there was one question in there that you did get off,
You got it. Okay.
which was, is it sustainable?
Yes,
And
thank
so
you.
that was really the biggest factor that went into establishing the limit that we created. I started this budget process with the vision that it should ultimately be the position of the city when it comes to the benefit to take that same position that others are taking, which is it's the responsibility of the organization to pay for the healthcare of the family. And so that's where I had intended to go. But when we start balancing in, what is it going to cost? And then, of course, because one of our goals and priorities is fiscal sustainability, factoring that in with the cash flow models that we do, that's where we had to give. And so that's where this recommendation comes out shy of that goal that I have as your executive officer of trying to extend that policy to the employees. The approach we're taking is we're making as big of a dent into that as possible, and doing it in a way where this budget we believe is sustainable.
All right. So that said, Mr. Metzler, do you have anything else that you would like to add as it relates to the proposed budget before we move on?
I think the only thing that I would add is we've got a little time until we put the final document before you. And so it is a lot to certainly digest, both in the paper form and then, of course, the presentation. I'm available along with my team to answer any questions or help you with any issues you might have.
Okay, very good. Thank you, Mr. Metzler. And as I know my colleagues would agree with me, this is a very thorough, comprehensive budget, a lot of studying for all of us, but it's very helpful because we do have important decisions before us and making sure that we have a safe and healthy and wholesome city. So with that said, our business this evening is concluded, but as a matter of housekeeping, the chair asks that all council members, staff, and audience members to kindly vacate the council chambers in City Hall within 10 minutes. So that would be 7:20, so that these facilities may be secured for the evening. Thank you, everyone. The meeting is adjourned.
Thank you, staff who showed up. Thank you very much for being here. Very well put together.